Jamal Williams, a 27-year-old software programmer from Brooklyn, had spent months preparing for his wedding to Rachel Carter. Rachel, a successful social media personality with a wide following, had captivated Jamal with her charisma and ambition. Her followers adored her for her honesty and openness about her life, though she had always kept her personal details, her past, her family, her struggles at a guarded distance. This element of mystery intrigued her fans and had only deepened Jamal's interest in her when they first met through mutual friends. For Jamal, this wedding was a moment of pure celebration and new beginnings. Behind the joyful preparations, however, there was an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. Diana Williams, Jamal's 52-year-old mother, had made no secret of her disapproval of the union. Diana was a fiercely protective and commanding woman who had raised Jamal on her own after his father left when he was a child. In her eyes, no one was truly worthy of her only son, and her protective nature veered into obsession when it came to Rachel. Despite Rachel's best efforts to win her over, Diana's stance remained unyielding. Diana viewed Rachel as an outsider, a possible manipulator, and most alarmingly to her, a potential threat to her influence over Jamal. As the wedding date drew near, Diane's opposition only intensified. She began delving into Rachel's past, using every resource at her disposal to unearth anything that might solidify her claims. As a woman who had grown up in a small, traditional community, Diane harbored strong views on how women should present themselves. She could not comprehend Rachel's online persona and perceived her openness as shameless self-promotion. Late into the night, Diana would pore over Rachel's old posts, scrutinizing each word, each photograph, each trace of her life before Jamal. And then she found something, a small, shadowed piece of Rachel's past that confirmed her worst suspicions. The details Diana discovered, though ultimately mundane, were enough to fuel her hatred and deepen her conviction that Rachel was dangerous. From that moment on, her determination to stop the wedding became her singular obsession, a dark mission she believed was solely for her son's benefit. Friends and family noticed her growing fixation, but assumed it was simply maternal worry. No one foresaw the lengths Diana would ultimately go to, and no one suspected how that day at the altar would take a tragic turn. The air was filled with anticipation on the morning of Jamal and Rachel's wedding. The venue, a picturesque chapel in upstate New York, surrounded by towering oaks and blooming wildflowers, was designed to capture Rachel's dream of an intimate, enchanting ceremony. Every detail, from the flowers lining the aisle to the flickering candlelight, was carefully chosen by the bride to create a magical atmosphere. Guests began arriving, friends and family eager to celebrate the love between Jamal and Rachel. The guest whispers, laughter, and excitement filled the chapel as they settled into their seats. Jamal stood at the altar, dressed in a crisp black suit, his face a blend of nerves and excitement. He awaited Rachel's entrance, taking slow, deep breaths to steady himself. His closest friends flanked him, offering encouraging nods. Despite his nerves, his eyes gleamed with pure happiness, reflecting the joy that the day symbolized for him. But amidst the smiles and celebrations, Diana's eyes gleamed with pure joy. Diana sat in the front row, her expression fixed in a stony mask. Dressed in a severe dark gown, she seemed out of place among the other guests, many of whom had opted for soft, celebratory colors. Her gaze was unrelenting, fixed upon Jamal with a determined, almost fanical intensity. She watched each moment unfold as though she were a predator, ready to pounce at the first sign of threat to her son. Rachel finally made her entrance, radiant in her white dress, her smile bright and wide as she locked eyes with Jamal. For a moment, all the tension, all of Deanna's cold stare, and all the worries that had plagued Jamal and Rachel over the past months seemed to melt away. Their eyes met, and Jamal felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The chapel quieted as Rachel walked down the aisle, the only sound being the soft rustle of her gown and the occasional murmur of admiration from the guests. As the officiant began the ceremony, Dion's hands clenched around the small clutch bag she held. Inside, her fingers brushed against the cold metal handle of a cake knife she had brought from the reception area, tool that had no place here, but had been brought with purpose. In her mind, she had convinced herself that this was her duty, her last resort, to protect Jamal from what she believed to be a grave mistake. The vows began, and Jamal spoke with sincerity and warmth, describing how Rachel had changed his life, how she had taught him to be brave, to open up, to live fully. His voice shook slightly as he expressed his love, looking at Rachel with a devotion that stirred the guests' emotions. As he finished, the congregation let out a collective sigh, touched by his words. Rachel, tearing up, prepared to share her own vows, glancing lovingly at her soon-to-be husband. But just as she began, a loud voice pierced the air, Diana's voice, rising in fury, cutting through the moment like a knife. The room fell silent as Diana Williams' voice rang out, laced with anger and disdain. Guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging shocked glances, unsure how to respond. The officiant froze, caught off guard by the sudden interruption. All eyes were on Diana, who had risen from her seat, her face twisted with fury. Without hesitation, she began to hurl accusations at Rachel, her words sharp and vicious. She painted Rachel as an imposter, a deceiver who, in her view, was manipulating Jamal for personal gain. To many in attendance, Diana's accusations seemed bizarre, but the ferocity behind her words was unsettling. Jamal's face turned pale as he stood, immobilized, unable to believe what was unfolding. Rachel, visibly shaken but resolute, stood her ground. Her hands gripped her bouquet tightly, knuckles white, her gaze unwavering. She was familiar with Diana's disapproval, but hadn't anticipated this level of public humiliation on her wedding day. A murmur rippled through the guests, torn between sympathy for Rachel and discomfort at the spectacle Diana was creating. Jamal finally found his voice, urging his mother to stop, his tone laced with desperation. He attempted to calm Diana down, to de-escalate the situation and salvage what remained of their ceremony, but Diana's resolve was impenetrable. She was consumed by her belief that she was acting in Jamal's best interest, that this was her final stand to protect him. Then, in one swift, horrifying motion, Diana reached into her clutch. Before anyone fully grasped what was happening, she lunged forward, clutching the cake knife. Her target was clear. With unyielding determination, she plunged the blade into Rachel, cutting short the wedding, the vows, and a life in a single brutal act. Rachel gasped, her bouquet slipping from her hand, the vibrant flowers scattering across the chapel floor. The crowd erupted in screams and chaos as guests tried to process the horrific scene before them. Jamal's scream was drowned out by the rising panic, his voice cracking with a mixture of shock and heartbreak as he reached for Rachel. His hands trembling. In a matter of seconds, The joyful atmosphere of the ceremony had transformed into a nightmare. Jamal held Rachel close, his hands stained with blood as he tried futilely to stop the bleeding. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and agony, unable to speak, but communicating everything she felt in those last moments. Deanna stood back, watching her son cradle Rachel's lifeless body, her expression unreadable. In her mind, she had accomplished what she set out to do. She had protected her son from what she saw as a dangerous mistake. As guests shouted for help, the horror of what she'd done began to settle over the room. Diana's demeanor changed, her composure slipping as she took in the full weight of the scene she had created. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by panicked guests who had fled the chapel to call for emergency assistance. Officers entered the building, their faces grim as they took in the scene. The shattered groom, the bloodied bride, and the distraught guests who remained in stunned silence. Diana Williams, the mother of the groom and the perpetrator, stood by in shock, her eyes vacant, as if she too was coming to terms with the irreversible consequences of her actions. The arrest was swift and unceremonious. Diana offered no resistance as officers cuffed her gaze fixed on Jamal as he held Rachel's lifeless body. Paramedics survived, but there was nothing to be done. Rachel was gone, her life extinguished in the very place where she had come to celebrate her love and future. Diana was led out of the chapel, her silence echoing through the space. The guests, many of whom had known Diana for years, found themselves grappling with disbelief and horror at the violence she had unleashed. In the days that followed, the story made headlines, capturing national attention as a case of unimaginable betrayal. "Mother murders bride at altar," blared the headlines, along with phrases like "wedding day horror" and "family tragedy unfolds in front of dozens." Journalists swarmed the town, attempting to piece together the factors that led to this violent climax. Diana's friends, co-workers, and neighbors were interviewed, and the narrative that emerged painted a disturbing portrait of a woman who had lost her way, consumed by a possessive and obsessive love for her son. For Jamal, life became a haze of grief and guilt. His nights were plagued by recurring nightmares of the attack, his mind replaying the scene over and over, searching for a way he could have prevented the tragedy. Therapy became his only solace, but even that felt insufficient to address the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The mother who had raised him, who had been his guardian and protector for so many years, had transformed into the very person who shattered his life in the most unimaginable way. In prison, Diana offered no apology for her actions. During her trial, she justified her behavior by claiming she was protecting Jamal from what she believed was a dangerous woman. Her defense painted her as a mother, overwhelmed by misguided concern. But the jury saw it differently. After a brief deliberation, Diana Williams was convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The trial of Diana Williams captivated the nation, drawing media attention from across the country. Journalists from major networks descended on Brooklyn, documenting every stage of the case. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public, each eager to witness the proceedings. Many residents of Pine Lake and Brooklyn alike were eager to understand what had driven a mother to commit such an unfathomable crime on her own son's wedding day. The prosecution painted Diana as a manipulative and deeply possessive woman, whose obsession with her son led her to cross moral boundaries. They presented evidence of her controlling behavior, her intrusive investigations into Rachel's past, and her escalating anger as the wedding date approached. Witnesses, including Jamal's close friends and family members, testified about her increasing hostility and bizarre actions in the months leading up to the wedding. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came in the form of a journal discovered during the investigation. Diana had kept meticulous notes, detailing her suspicions and frustrations over Rachel. In the journal, she referred to Rachel as a threat and spoke of eliminating her as the only solution. To the prosecution, the journal was a damning piece of evidence demonstrating premeditation in Diana's state of mind. They argued that Diana's actions were driven not by genuine concern for her son, but by a twisted need to control his life, even if it meant destroying him in the process. Meanwhile, the defense attempted to frame Diana's actions as those of a mother overwhelmed by fear for her son. They brought in psychologists to testify about Diana's mental state, describing her as a woman suffering from delusions and paranoid tendencies. They claimed that she genuinely believed Rachel posed a threat to her son, painting Diana as a tragic figure who acted out of misguided love. Jamel attended every day of the trial, sitting silently in the back of the courtroom, visibly distraught. He refused to make eye contact with his mother, whose cold expression remained unbroken. To the world, he became a symbol of unimaginable grief, a man betrayed by the very person he had once trusted most in the world. Friends and strangers alike reached out to him, but he struggled to find solace, unable to make sense of the tragedy. As the trial progressed, public opinion began to shift. Many who had initially sympathized with Diana saw the brutality of her actions for what it was. The town, too, struggled with the reality of the crime. In Pine Lake, where Diana had been a respected figure, neighbors expressed shock and horror. The place that had once seemed safe and insular now held the dark shadow of tragedy, and the residents grappled with the realization that someone they thought they knew had harbored such malice. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. In a tense, packed courtroom, Diana Williams was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, condemning her to live the rest of her days within prison walls. As the sentence was read aloud, Diana's composure cracked for the first time. A single tear traced down her cheek, though whether it was from regret or a final realization of her lost freedom, no one could say. Jamal felt an intense wave of relief, yet it was tinged with sorrow. He had spent months hoping for closure, yet watching his mother being led away and handcuffed did little to soothe the ache that had settled within him. The trial had forced him to relive the trauma again and again, and each moment seemed to deepen the wound. He couldn't reconcile the mother who had raised him with the woman who had destroyed his life in a fit of delusional rage. In the days following the verdict, Jamal tried to piece together a new life. Support poured in from friends, his therapy sessions intensified, and even returned to work, attempting to rediscover a sense of normalcy. Yet the shadow of what had happened followed him everywhere. The wedding that was meant to symbolize the beginning of a new life had ended in horror, and each day was a reminder of Rachel's absence. Friends offered invitations, urging him to move on, but the betrayal from his mother left scars that ran deep. No matter how much he tried to accept the tragedy, the questions lingered. The media eventually moved on, the headlines fading as news stories emerged. The town of Pine Lake gradually returned to its quiet routines, though memories of the horrific event lingered like a scar in the minds of its residents. Diana's home, once filled with family memories, became an empty shell, abandoned in silence. For Jamal, it was a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. The journal Diana had kept was eventually given to Jamal, its pages detailing her obsession in stark detail. He read it only once, each entry revealing a mother whose love had transformed into an irrational, possessive need. Closing the journal, he realized there was no true explanation, only a warped, painful reflection of a woman who had allowed herself to be consumed by her own darkness. In the end, Jamal made a decision to leave Brooklyn. The memories of Rachel, the ghosts of his former life, haunted the streets he had once loved. He moved to a quiet town upstate, seeking peace and solitude, hoping to finally rebuild the life that had been stolen from him on that fateful day. Jamal's relocation offered him a much-needed distance from the painful memories of his former life. He chose a small town upstate, an unassuming place where he could blend in, hoping to escape the prying eyes and lingering whispers of Brooklyn. The town's quiet streets included nature, promised him solitude, a chance to start anew without the shadow of tragedy lurking around every corner. Jamal rented a modest one-bedroom apartment overlooking a lake, its waters calm and reflective, like the peace he hoped to find. He started a new job with a tech firm that allowed him to work remotely, providing him the stability of work without the daily pressure of socializing. His days took on a new rhythm, one focused on healing. Early mornings were spent jogging along the lakeside, afternoons working, and evenings in quiet reflection, piecing together fragments of who he was outside of the trauma. Therapy remained an anchor in his life, and though he was hesitant at first, he agreed to participate in grief counseling sessions specifically tailored for individuals affected by violent crime. In these sessions, he found himself connecting with others who had been through equally devastating losses. The group became a source of comfort, a place where he could speak openly without judgment or discomfort. With time, he began to share his story in bits and pieces, each admission feeling like the release of a burden he had carried for far too long. In one particular session, Jamal spoke about Rachel, about the way her laughter could light up a room, her relentless optimism, and the plans they had made. He spoke about the betrayal he felt, the betrayal that had come not only from his mother's violent act, but from her inability to see Rachel as the loving, kind person he knew. As he spoke, the group listened intently, offering words of empathy and validation. Slowly, he began to feel less isolated, less burdened by the tragedy he had kept locked away. Months passed, and Jamal found himself wanting to confront his grief and anger more directly. He couldn't ignore the ache of unanswered questions. His mother's actions had left him with a gnawing need for understanding, though he knew that some aspects would remain a mystery forever. One morning, he decided to visit the prison where Diana was being held, a decision that took weeks of mental preparation and consultation with his therapist. His goal was not forgiveness, but closure, to confront the woman who had robbed him of Rachel, his future, and a mother he thought he knew. The prison was cold and foreboding, its walls towering and gray against the winter sky. Sitting in the sterile visiting room, Jamal felt a weight settle over him, a mix of anger and sadness pressing down on him. When Diana was brought in, she looked older, her face lined with an exhaustion that prison life had only deepened. She met his gaze with a mixture of shame and defiance, as though she were both sorry for what she had done and resolute in her belief that she had acted out of love. Their conversation was strained, punctuated by moments of painful silence. Jamal asked her why she felt so threatened by Rachel, why she had let her hatred consume her to the point of violence. Diana's answers were fragmented, a web of paranoid justifications and distorted claims of protecting her son. It became clear to Jamal that she still held on to her belief that she had saved him from a mistake. Her reasoning was convoluted, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she lacked true remorse. She had rewritten the narrative in her mind, framing herself as a misguided but well-meaning mother rather than a murderer. Leaving the prison that day, Jamal felt a strange sense of finality. He understood that his mother's obsessive love had blinded her, leading her down a path of irreversible destruction. While the visit didn't bring him the understanding he'd hoped for, it confirmed one thing. He needed to let go of any expectation of remorse or resolution from her. This realization marked a turning point. Jamal returned to his new life with a sense of acceptance, acknowledging that some wounds would never fully heal, but that he could still rebuild, even with the scars left behind. As months turned into years, Jamal continued piecing together a new life, holding on to the memories of Rachel that still brought him solace. He began to volunteer with a local organization that supported families affected by violent crime, finding purpose in offering comfort to others who, like him, had suffered unspeakable losses. The work was difficult, often reopening his own wounds, but it was also healing. Every story he heard reminded him of the strength it took to rebuild after tragedy. In Rachel's memory, he established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in media and communication. Through the fund, he hoped to honor Rachel's ambition and passion for connecting with others. Rachel had always been a champion for voices that weren't often heard, and Jamal felt that supporting young women who might follow in her footsteps was a way of ensuring that her legacy lived on. Word of the scholarship spread through social media, and soon Rachel's fans and followers, many of whom had mourned her loss, contributed to the fund. The scholarship became a small but enduring tribute, a bright spot amid the darkness left behind by her death. Jamal's life became anchored in quiet routines. He took up hiking, spending weekends exploring trails along the lake near his new town, finding peace in the silence of the forest. Each step along the winding paths was a reminder of his own journey, of the pain he carried, but also the strength he had found to keep moving forward. He began keeping a journal, filling it with memories of Rachel, reflections on his grief, and insights from the therapy sessions that had become a permanent fixture in his life. Through his volunteer work in the scholarship fund, he found himself slowly emerging from the isolation that had once held him captive. He reconnected with old friends and eventually opened himself up to the idea of new relationships. He was careful, taking each step cautiously, aware of how deeply the scars of his past had marked him. It took time to trust, to believe that he could let people in without fear of further loss. But he also recognized that Rachel's life and the love they had shared had taught him the importance of openness and connection. Jamal's mother, Diana, remained in prison, and though he would occasionally receive letters from her, he rarely opened them. Each letter, he imagined, was another attempt to justify what could never be justified. He kept them in a small, unmarked box, unread but acknowledged, like pieces of a past he had long left behind. They were reminders of a painful chapter, one he had chosen to close for his own peace. In time, Jamal felt a shift within himself. The rage, the despair, and the loneliness that had once dominated his life began to fade. In their place was a quiet resilience, an understanding that while tragedy had shaped him, it did not define him. The memory of Rachel remained his guiding light, a reminder of love and joy that could never be erased by the violence of a single day. Years later, Jamal stood at the edge of the lake near his home, watching the morning sun cast a warm glow over the water. He reflected on how far he had come from that dark day at the chapel. Though the pain had lessened, it had not disappeared. Instead, it had transformed into something he carried within him, a quiet strength rather than an open wound. In the time since the tragedy, Jamal had found new friendships and even love. He shared his story openly, both as a testament to Rachel's life and as a way of reclaiming his own. Though he never forgot the devastation of that day, he also chose to remember the years of happiness, laughter, and love he had shared with Rachel. Those memories had become a part of him, woven into his very being, and they brought him comfort even in moments of sorrow. The scholarship fund, in Rachel's name, continued to grow, helping dozens of young women pursue their dreams. Each recipient represented another piece of Rachel's legacy, another life touched by the kindness and ambition that had defined her. In this way, Jamal felt that Rachel's influence lived on, her spirit a guiding force that continued to bring light into the world. Diana remained incarcerated, and Jamal accepted that she would never truly understand the magnitude of what she had done. But he also came to terms with the fact that her actions were beyond his control, and that he could choose his own path forward. Rather than letting the shadow of her crime dictate his life, he focused on building a future that honored Rachel's memory and allowed him to find peace. As he stood by the lake, Jamal took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of release. His journey had been long and painful, marked by betrayal and loss, but also by resilience and growth. He had chosen to rise above the tragedy, to find purpose in the aftermath, and to carry forward the love that had once filled his life. In the end, Jamal understood that while he would always carry the scars of that day, he had also discovered an inner strength, the resilience that allowed him to transform pain into purpose and to create a life that honored Rachel's memory. And as the sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the lake, he knew he had finally found peace. Years after the tragedy that had redefined his life, Jamal found himself at the annual ceremony for the Rachel Carter Memorial Scholarship. The scholarship, now in its 10th year, had grown substantially, helping over 100 young women pursue careers in media, journalism, and communications. As he watched this year's recipients step forward to accept their awards, Jamal felt a quiet pride and a deep sense of fulfillment. The scholarship had become more than a tribute. It was a legacy, a way of ensuring that Rachel's warmth, strength, and passion would live on through others. The people who gathered to honor Rachel's memory each year had become a second family for Jamal. Friends, colleagues, and scholarship recipients filled the room, each of them carrying forward a part of Rachel's story. They shared stories of how she had inspired them, laughing and reminiscing about her vibrant personality, her kindness, and her remarkable influence. Though she was gone, her spirit lingered in the lives she had touched, a gentle but enduring presence that time could not erase.